restaurant was called Brenner and Zone, and it had been serving schnitzel and overpriced Riesling to Berlin's upper crust for 61 years. It sat on the quieter end of Unter den Linden, its exterior unmarked, except for a small brass plate by the door that most people walked past without reading. The kind of place that didn't advertise. The kind of place that didn't need to. Tonight it was closed to the public. Every table was occupied, every bottle already open, every waiter already paid. Not by the restaurant, but by the man seated at the back corner booth, a man whose name, depending on which government you asked, was either Victor Saurin or did not exist at all. Victor Saurin had built his empire across 3 decades and 4 continents by understanding one simple truth. The people who protected you mattered more than the people who feared you. He had cultivated that protection carefully, paying in gold coin, honoring every marker, never conducting business inside Continental walls, and never, not once, acting against a sanctioned operator. He was not a violent man by preference. He was a man who paid other violent men, which was cleaner, and which had kept him alive and comfortable into his 63rd year, while rivals younger and louder than him were buried in places nobody checked. He was midway through a plate of pan-roasted duck when the cardiac episode began. It did not announce itself dramatically. There was no clutching of the chest, no gasping, no theatrical collapse. Victor Saurin simply paused. His fork stopped moving. His mouth, which had been forming the first syllable of a sentence about shipping routes out of Gdansk, closed. His eyes, which had been sharp and watchful all evening, became very still. He sat that way for 3 seconds, perfectly upright, perfectly composed, as if listening to something only he could hear. And then he was dead. His body did not fall. It settled very slowly, like a building choosing to lean rather than topple, and came to rest with his forehead against the rim of his wine glass, which did not break. Across the restaurant, at a two-top near the window that he had reserved under a different name 3 days prior, light Yagami lifted a small leather-bound notebook from his lap, clicked his pen shut, and set it inside his jacket pocket. He did not look at Victor Saurin. He did not need to. He picked up his glass of sparkling water, took a slow sip, and turned his gaze to the window and the wet Berlin street beyond it, where yellow headlights blurred across the rain-slicked asphalt like brush strokes from a painter working fast. His face was calm. Not the calm of someone relieved, the calm of someone confirming what they already knew would happen. He was 23 years old, and he had been Kira for over a year. What light Yagami had not done, what he had, in the careful architecture of his evening, failed to account for, was the man in the grey coat sitting at the bar. The man's name was Decker. He had no last name on record anywhere that mattered. He was a Continental-sanctioned operative out of the Frankfurt house, nominally present tonight as additional security for Victor Saurin at the request of one of Saurin's associates who did not entirely trust the restaurant's own arrangements. Decker was not a paranoid man. He was a precise one. And what he was precise about, above all else, was watching rooms. It was the first thing they taught you and the last thing that kept you alive. And Decker had been watching this room since the moment he sat down. He had watched the young man at the two-top arrive 12 minutes before Saurin. He had clocked the notebook, unusual, in a restaurant where most people used phones. He had noted the young man's posture, too still for someone eating alone, too controlled for someone who was simply waiting. And then Victor Saurin had died without a sound, without a mark, without any preceding indication of distress, and Decker had watched the young man at the two-top close that notebook and put it in his jacket and take a sip of his water as though he had just finished reading a pleasant paragraph. Decker did not move. He finished his drink. He watched the room descend into controlled panic. Waiters rushing, someone calling emergency services. Saurin's own men gathering around the booth with the specific confusion of people who had prepared for many threats, and not for this one. He watched the young man leave a folded bill on the table, button his jacket, and walk out through the front door into the rain with the unhurried ease of someone catching an early train. Decker waited 90 seconds. Then he walked to the table the young man had vacated, looked at it briefly, and left the restaurant by the same door. Outside, the rain was steady and cold and smelled of wet stone and diesel and the particular mineral sharpness of a Berlin November. The young man was already a block ahead, walking east, collar up, hands in his pockets. Decker did not follow him. He had no need to. He had already seen his face, and in this particular profession, a face was a beginning. He took out a small encrypted phone and made a call. "Victor Saurin is dead," he said, when the line connected. No violence, no indication. The room was clean, but there was a young man. He paused, not from uncertainty, from the specific discipline of choosing words correctly. "I need to report what I observed. I think the table needs to hear it." 3 kilometers east, light Yagami walked into a U-Bahn station, descended 2 flights of stairs, and stood on a platform that smelled of iron and stale air and the faint sweetness of someone's spilled coffee. He was perfectly dry despite the rain. He had planned his route under covered walkways. He did this with everything, mapped it, tested it, walked it twice before it mattered. The notebook sat against his ribs, warm from his body. He did not think about Victor Saurin. Victor Saurin had been a necessary correction, a man who had trafficked people through 3 Eastern European networks while buying protection from people who should have known better. Kira did not make exceptions for wealth. That was precisely the point. The world needed to understand that no amount of coin, no amount of institutional protection would shelter the guilty from judgment. Not anymore. Floating 3 feet above him and slightly to the left, invisible to every person on the platform, Ryuk tilted his enormous head and watched the train approach through the dark tunnel with the patient, curious expression of a creature that had seen everything and still found humans moderately interesting. "You know," Ryuk said, his voice carrying that characteristic rasp, like gravel shifting inside a hollow drum. The man at the bar had a very specific kind of eyes. "I know," Light said quietly, without moving his lips, watching the train's headlights grow in the dark. The kind of eyes that file things away. "I know," Light said again. The train arrived. The doors opened. Light stepped inside and found a seat near the window, and the doors closed behind him, and the station fell away into darkness and somewhere above the city, in a direction that had nothing to do with geography. The machinery of something very old and very precise began, slowly, to turn. He did not yet know the name of the organization that would come for him. He did not yet know what a gold coin meant in the world he had just disturbed. He did not yet know that Victor Saurin had not merely been a criminal. He had been an asset, a revenue stream, a protected name. And that in killing him so cleanly and so publicly, Light had not simply committed a murder. He had reached into a mechanism built over centuries and snapped one of its gears. In a city he had never visited, in a room with no windows, a phone rang. The adjudicator answered it on the second ring. She listened for 45 seconds without speaking. "Send me everything," she said. Then, "And confirm. No toxin, no device, nothing physical." A pause. "Interesting," she said. She set the phone down and looked at the wall, where a list of names ran in careful columns. Her hand moved to a fresh line at the bottom. She wrote nothing yet. She simply let the pen rest on the paper, thinking, with the calm of someone who had processed many problems and found that the unrecognizable ones were always the most instructive. Somewhere in Berlin, a train moved through the dark beneath the city, and a young man sat with his hands folded in his lap and looked at his own reflection in the black window glass and thought about what came next. He always thought about what came next. He had not yet considered that someone else might be doing the same thing. If you love deep dive crossovers that respect both worlds, smash subscribe and drop your dream matchup in the comments. Wonder Woman in Star Trek, Saitama in The Boys? The multiverse is wide open, and we're building it one story at a time. The room had no name. It appeared on no architectural record, no building schematic, no fire safety filing. It existed 3 levels below a private members club in Zurich whose above-ground operations, wine, cigars, discreet conversation, served as both revenue and camouflage. The walls were stone. The table was a single slab of black granite, 12 feet long, installed in pieces and assembled underground because it could not fit through any door. The chairs around it were high-backed, leather, identical. There were 14 of them. Tonight, 11 were occupied. The remaining 3 belonged to seats whose holders had sent representatives, which was acceptable. The high table did not require presence. It required participation. The adjudicator stood at the head of the room, not at the table but beside it, in the precise strip of space that her role had always occupied. Neither seated among them nor elevated above them, but adjacent, like a blade kept within reach. Her name was never spoken in these rooms. Her function was her identity. She had held the position for 9 years, and in that time had administered sanctions against 4 Continental managers, 2 elder-appointed handlers, and 1 sitting table member whose breach of protocol had been both egregious and ultimately instructive to the others. She was 41 years old. She wore gray. She carried a leather folio and a pen, and she had not sat down since entering the room 40 minutes ago. She had spent those 40 minutes explaining what Decker had reported. The room had been very quiet throughout. This was not the quiet of patience. This was the quiet of people who were accustomed to controlling their reactions and were, for the first time in some while, finding that discipline genuinely necessary. "No toxin," said the man at the far end of the table, a Frenchman whose family had held his seat for 4 generations. He was not asking. He was repeating it back the way one repeats something that does not pass correctly. No device, no contact, no mechanism. A man wrote in a notebook and Victor Saurin died of cardiac arrest. That is what was observed, the adjudicator said. Decker is reliable. Decker has been sanctioned 11 years without incident. His report was filed within 2 hours before he could have known Saurin was already under our protection. He had no motive to fabricate and no framework in which fabrication would benefit him. "Then the question," said a woman to the left, Japanese, representing interests that stretched across 6 Pacific nations, "is not whether we believe him. The question is what we are actually dealing with." She paused. "And whether there is a precedent." There was not. That was the answer, and everyone in the room already knew it, and its weight sat on the granite table between them like something physical. In the entire recorded history of the High Table, which was longer than most governments, longer than most religions of the modern configuration, longer than the countries whose intelligence agencies occasionally tried to map it and consistently failed, there had been killings by poison that mimicked natural death, killings by induced cardiac event through precisely placed electrical charge, killings achieved through pharmacological manipulation over months. All of these had mechanisms. All of them had, when examined closely enough, a chain of cause and effect that a careful person could follow back to a human hand. What Decker had described had no such chain. A young man had written something. A protected asset had died. The space between those 2 facts was empty. The High Table did not like empty spaces. Empty spaces were where control went to disappear. "Victor Saurin's value to our network," the adjudicator continued, opening her folio to a marked page, "was approximately 11 million coin per operating cycle, routed through his logistics infrastructure across Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic corridor. That revenue is now interrupted indefinitely. Beyond the financial disruption, Saurin was a sanctioned asset under active protection. His death without our knowledge or consent represents a direct violation of the order we maintain. Someone, this young man, reached into our network and removed a piece of it, without asking, without coin, without any acknowledgement that the network existed at all." She closed the folio. "That is not merely a loss. That is a statement." The Frenchman leaned back in his chair. "A statement implies intention." "Correct. Does he know what Saurin was to us?" "Unknown. It is possible he identified Saurin only as a criminal whose death he judged appropriate. It is also possible he is testing a boundary. Either way, the effect is identical." The adjudicator looked along the table with the steady patience of someone explaining something for the last time she intends to explain it. "A precedent has been set. If Kira and the intelligence we have been developing on this individual over the past 14 months strongly suggests this is the same actor responsible for cardiac arrest deaths across 7 countries. If Kira is willing and able to kill a High Table asset without detection, then he is a variable we do not control. And variables we do not control, in our experience, become problems we eventually cannot solve." The room was quiet again. The ventilation system made a low, consistent sound like breathing. "There is a second dimension to this," said a man who had not yet spoken, heavy-set, his accent placing him somewhere in the Eastern Adriatic. He had the specific stillness of someone who had done very dangerous things for a very long time. "This Kira, his method kills without contact, without proximity, potentially, without leaving a trace we can follow. If that is genuinely what we are dealing with, then the conventional calculus of our operations changes considerably." He let that settle. "We send someone after him. He learns their name. They die of a heart attack in a hotel room. We send someone else. Same result. At what point does it become a question of whether we can field operatives against a target who can kill them before they ever get close. It was the right question. The adjudicator had been waiting for someone to ask it, because the answer shaped everything that came after. That, she said, is precisely why the contract must be structured differently. We are not dealing with a target who poses a physical threat to our operatives in the conventional sense. We are dealing with a target whose weapon requires a specific condition to function. He must know the name. He must know the face, which means our operatives enter the field nameless. No records, no Continental registration, ghost protocol, full suppression across every database we touch. He cannot kill what he cannot identify. She allowed a brief pause. And we send enough of them that identification becomes for him an unsolvable problem. The vote, when it came, was not close. 11 seats, 11 in favor. The motion passed in under 4 minutes, which was, by the standards of this table, nearly instantaneous. The adjudicator wrote 2 things in her folio. The first was a number, circa 40 million. The second was a name, not the young man's true name, which they did not yet have confirmed, but the name the world had given him. Kira. She wrote it the way she wrote everything. Cleanly, without flourish, with the quiet finality of a person who understood that written things had weight. Then she picked up a gold coin from the small stack on the table beside her. They were always there, always ready, the grammar of this world's most serious sentences, and set it down in the center of the black granite with a sound like a full stop. The contract is open, she said. Global, no continental exclusion zones, any operator, any house, any affiliation. 40 million coin for confirmed termination. An additional 5 million for any intelligence that advances our understanding of his method. She looked at the coin on the table. We are not simply removing a threat. We are reclaiming jurisdiction over death. That is what he has taken from us. That is what we will take back. She closed her folio. Find out who he is, she said. Then find out where he is. Then send the first wave. She picked up her pen and her folio and walked to the door, and the 11 men and women at the granite table began the specific, efficient work of people who had ended careers, nations, and lives before, and who found this particular problem not frightening but clarifying. This was what they did. This was the order they maintained. The gold coin sat in the center of the table, catching the low light until a hand reached out and covered it. 40 million coin. Global reach. Every ghost the network could field. In Berlin, light Yagami was asleep. He did not dream about Victor Saurin. He did not dream about Decker at the bar, or the notebook, or the train ride home through the dark beneath the city. He slept the clean, untroubled sleep of a person who had done what they intended to do and was satisfied with the result. By morning, his face was in 14 cities. Light Yagami had been in Berlin for 11 weeks under the name Kenji Nakamura, a graduate exchange student attached to the Humboldt University's criminology department, which was both a functional cover and, in the private architecture of his sense of humor, a small joke he allowed himself. The apartment he rented was on the 4th floor of a pre-war building in Mitte, clean and spare, furnished with the anonymous IKEA efficiency of someone who had not intended to stay long, and had since quietly extended that intention without updating the furniture. He had one bag he could pack in 4 minutes. He had 3 exit routes mapped from the building, including one through the basement that emerged onto a side street with no camera coverage. He had a second identity. Haruki Sato, postgraduate, University of Tokyo, prepared and sealed in a waterproof case behind a section of loose baseboard in the bedroom wall. He had not needed it yet. He had always known he might. His mornings followed a structure. He rose at 6, ran 4 kilometers along a route that varied by day of the week according to a rotation he had designed himself, returned, showered, and spent 90 minutes at his desk reviewing what he called the ledger. Not the death note, which lived always against his body in a custom inner pocket of whichever jacket he was wearing, but a separate encrypted document on a laptop that connected only through a layered series of proxy servers in which he tracked his cases, targets, their crimes, the evidence he had assembled, the status of each name. He was methodical about this in the way that a surgeon is methodical, not because methodology brought him pleasure, but because sloppiness cost lives, and the lives it cost were always the wrong ones. He had been in Berlin specifically because of a cluster. 6 names connected through a human trafficking network that moved people westward through Poland and into Germany, funneling them into labor and other arrangements that Light did not allow himself to describe euphemistically in his own internal monologue, because euphemism, he had long since decided, was how guilty men slept. Victor Saurin had been the financial architecture of the cluster. His death 2 nights prior had been the keystone removal. The remaining 5 names would take another 3 weeks, carefully spaced. Causes of death varied enough to frustrate pattern recognition by local authorities. He had not considered that anyone other than local authorities might be paying attention. The first tell came on a Tuesday, just after 10 in the morning, on the U2 line between Stadtmitte and Potsdamer Platz. It was not dramatic. It was a reflection in the train window. A man, mid-40s, standing near the doors, reading a newspaper with the specific quality of attention that is not actually attention to the newspaper. Light had trained himself to notice this distinction years ago, in the period after L had first appeared and surveillance had become a constant ambient pressure in his life. There was how people read when they were reading and how people held reading material when they were watching something else. The difference lived in the eyes and in the angle of the head and in the way the pages never quite turned at the rate that genuine engagement with text would require. This man's pages had not turned in 4 minutes. Light did not react. This was the first discipline and the most important one. The moment a surveillance subject showed awareness of surveillance, the dynamic shifted in ways that were almost always disadvantageous. He looked at his own phone. He let 2 stops pass. At Potsdamer Platz he got off, not because it was his intended stop, but because exits were information, and he wanted to see what the man with the newspaper did. The man stayed on the train. Light stood on the platform and watched the train leave and felt 2 things simultaneously. The first was relief, which was rational. The second was a quiet, persistent unease that was not relief's opposite, but its complication. Because the man staying on the train meant either that Light had misread the situation, possible, though he trusted his own pattern recognition, or that the tale was more sophisticated than one person, and the man with the newspaper had simply completed his segment of a relay and handed off to someone else already on the platform or already at the next stop. A relay tale required resources and, coordination. The people Light had been careful about until now. Interpol, the NPA, L's successors, were capable of relay surveillance, but they telegraphed differently. They had a bureaucratic texture to their operations, a procedural weight that this had not had. The man with the newspaper had been too clean, too practiced, too absent of the small, anxious adjustments that law enforcement tales made when they thought they might be burned. He took a different line home. He walked the last 6 blocks through a covered market that smelled of bread and roasting meat and the cold chemical sweetness of a flower stall in November. He checked his reflection in every plate glass window he passed. He saw nothing he could name as a problem. He arrived at his building, took the stairs, entered his apartment, and stood in the center of the room for a moment without turning on the lights. Ryuk was already there, because Ryuk was always already there, drifting near the ceiling in the particular way he had of occupying space, as though gravity were a suggestion he was considering but had not committed to. The Shinigami's enormous eyes tracked Light from the doorway. "You took the long way," Ryuk observed. "Someone on the U2, Light said, setting his jacket over the chair and moving to the window to look down at the street. The street was ordinary. Parked cars, a cyclist, a woman with a pushchair negotiating a curb. Nothing that should have snagged his attention. Professional, not police. Not police, Ryuk agreed, with the mild interest of someone confirming a weather forecast. The ones from this morning were different too. Light turned from the window. This morning. When you ran, there were 2. They didn't follow you. They were already placed. One at the north end of your route, one at the south. They watched you pass, and then they left. Ryuk tilted his head, which always made him look like a very large, very unsettling bird. I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure you'd find it interesting. But now it seems like you might. Light looked at him for a long moment. This was one of the consistent frustrations of his arrangement with Ryuk. The Shinigami's relationship with urgency was entirely aesthetic. Things were interesting, or they were not interesting. The category of things that were dangerous occupied a significant overlap with the category of things Ryuk found amusing, which meant his information sharing was colored by entertainment value rather than tactical relevance. Light had adjusted for this. He simply could not always adjust fast enough. "Describe them," he said. Ryuk described them. A man and a woman, both moving with the kind of physical economy that Light had learned to associate with trained operators rather than civilian. No visible communication between them. No earpieces. No phones out. Nothing that would read as coordination to anyone watching. They had simply been present, noted him, and withdrawn. Clean. Coordinated. And placed before his run began, which meant they had known his route, which meant either they had been watching him long enough to establish his pattern or they had capabilities he had not yet mapped. Light sat down at his desk. He did not open the laptop. He folded his hands and looked at the middle distance and thought with the focused, sequential clarity that was the closest thing he had to a survival instinct. He had a method that killed. Its condition was a name and a face. He had spent 2 years ensuring that no name attached to him in any operational context was his real one, and that his real face existed on as few records as possible. Against law enforcement, against intelligence services, against L's successors, that had been sufficient. But what he was beginning to suspect, and the suspicion had the cold, clarifying quality of a fact arriving slightly before its confirmation, was that whoever was running these operatives was not a government. Governments had databases. Governments had records. Governments were, at their foundation, bureaucracies, and bureaucracies left trails that a sufficiently intelligent person could navigate. What he was dealing with felt older than that, more lateral, less interested in jurisdiction. He thought about Victor Saurin dying at dinner. He thought about the man at the bar with the filing eyes. He thought about the 48 hours since and the specific quality of surveillance he had encountered. Professional, resourced, unhurried, as though whoever was running it was not trying to catch him quickly, but trying to understand him thoroughly before deciding how to proceed. That was not a police posture. That was a predator's posture. "Ryuk," he said quietly. How many people do you think are watching this building right now?" Ryuk drifted to the window and looked out with the advantage of being invisible and unbound by walls. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "4 that I can see. Probably more I can't. There are angles from the building across the street that I haven't checked." Light nodded slowly. 4 visible. More probable. Pre-positioned. Patient. He reached into his jacket and touched the cover of the death note with 2 fingers, not taking it out, just confirming it was there, the way other people touched a lucky charm or a scar. The problem, forming clearly now in the cold light of his own analysis, was this. You could not write a name you did not have. You could not write a face you could not attach to a record, and the people outside, patient, professional, placed before dawn, had given him nothing. Not a name on a buzzer, not a face on a camera, not a registration plate, not an ID, not a single thread he could pull towards something readable. For the first time in over a year, Light Yagami had a weapon with nothing to aim it at. He sat with that for a moment, very still, the way he always sat with problems that had not yet resolved into solutions. Then he began to plan. They came into Berlin the way weather comes. Not from one direction, not announced, not in a formation that any observer could have identified as a formation. One arrived by rail from Hamburg on a Tuesday evening, carrying a single bag and a ticket booked 40 minutes before departure, under a name that existed on 3 government databases and corresponded to no living person. One came by car from Prague, crossing at a minor checkpoint on a road that border control staffed lightly after 9 p.m. 2 flew in separately, different airlines, different terminals, 3 hours apart, each passing through passport control with documents that had been built over years rather than weeks. The difference between a forgery and a legend being exactly that depth of construction, that patience, that willingness to invest in a fiction long before it was needed. The last 2 were already in the city. Had been for 4 days. They had arrived before the contract was formally issued, which was either coincidence or indicated that someone in the network had moved very quickly on very early intelligence. And in this particular network, the answer to that kind of question was almost always the latter. 6 operators. No names between them that belonged to the real world. In the Continental's Ghost Protocol, operators under full suppression were referred to internally by color designations. Not names, not call signs. Nothing that could be overheard and retained and later written down in a notebook by a young man with a god complex and a supernatural pen. The adjudicator had been explicit about this in her operational briefing, which had been delivered not in writing but verbally, in a room with no recording devices, to the 6 people sitting in front of her, and which had contained one instruction she repeated twice. Do not, under any circumstances, allow this target to learn who you are. Not your name, not your history, not your face in any context where he has time to study it. You are instruments. Instruments do not have identities. Do your work and withdraw. They understood this because they were professionals, and professionals understood the operational logic of the constraints they were given, even when the constraints were unusual. What they had been told about the target's method was, in the frank assessment of most of them, somewhere between deeply strange and operationally irrelevant. A man with a notebook who could cause cardiac arrest at range was a problem outside their standard taxonomy, but the solution the adjudicator had proposed was structurally sound. Remove his ability to identify you. Coordinate tightly enough that he cannot isolate any single operator long enough to build a profile. Move fast enough that his intelligence gathering cannot keep pace with your approach. Standard close containment doctrine applied to a non-standard threat. They had worked with stranger parameters. What none of them had fully accounted for was the Shinigami. Light knew they had tightened the perimeter by Wednesday morning. Ryuk told him, not with any particular sense of urgency, but in the conversational tone he used for most things, drifting through the apartment walls and back with the freedom of something not subject to the physical world's objections. 7 now, he said, correcting his count from the previous evening. Possibly 8. There was one on the roof of the building to the north that he wasn't certain about, because the person was very still and Ryuk's interest in very still people was limited. Light added the correction to his internal map and said nothing. He had spent the night thinking and had arrived at the dimensions of the problem with the precision that sustained concentration produced in him when he applied it without interruption. The death note required 2 things, a face and a name. The face he could get. Ryuk could describe them, and Light was skilled enough at constructing composites from description that he could hold a working image in his mind. But a face without a name was a portrait without a label, and the notebook's mechanism was not symbolic. It was specific. He had tested its limits years ago, carefully, incrementally, and the conclusion was unambiguous. If the name was wrong, nothing happened. If the name was incomplete, nothing happened. You could not write a description. You could not write a role. You needed the name a person's parents had given them, or the name they had legally taken, the name attached to them in the record of the world. And these people had excised themselves from that record with a thoroughness that he was only beginning to appreciate. He tried anyway, because not trying was not in his nature, and because the attempt itself was informative. On Wednesday afternoon, using Ryuk's description of the woman who had been stationed on the corner of his street since early morning, he constructed the most precise mental image he could manage and opened the death note to a clean page. He held the pen above the paper. He thought about what he knew. Female, approximately 35, dark coat, Eastern European bone structure in Ryuk's approximate rendering, carrying nothing visible. He wrote a name. Not a name he believed was hers, but the most statistically probable German name for someone matching that profile, a controlled experiment, a test. He set the pen down. He waited 41 minutes. He looked out the window. The woman was still on the corner. He closed the notebook. So, that was the wall. What he did next was what he always did when direct action was foreclosed. He moved laterally. He could not kill them. He could not identify them through conventional means. They had no digital footprint he could access through his proxy network, no faces in any database he could reach, no vehicle registrations, no hotel bookings under names that surfaced anywhere. They were, for all practical purposes of his method, people who did not exist, but they existed in physical space. They occupied positions. They moved according to a logic. And logic, in Light's experience, was always eventually readable if you watched it long enough and were honest about what you were seeing. He needed them to make a mistake. Or he needed to engineer a situation in which a mistake became structurally inevitable. Those were not the same thing, and the second was considerably harder, but it was the one he had more control over, which made it the one worth pursuing. He left the apartment at 2 in the afternoon, which was earlier than his usual pattern by 90 minutes. A deliberate deviation designed to introduce mild pressure into whatever observation schedule they were running. He wore a different jacket than his usual rotation. He took the stairs to the basement, exited through the side street, and walked 3 blocks north before turning east toward the Hackescher Markt, which was crowded enough on a Wednesday afternoon to provide genuine cover and open enough that he could manage his sight lines with some confidence. Ryuk followed overhead, invisible, providing a running account in the unhelpful but directionally useful way that he always did. Yes, there's one behind you. No, not that one, the other one. I think there's another on the parallel street, but I got distracted by a pretzel vendor. Light, humans, and their food are genuinely fascinating to me. Light filtered the commentary for signal and moved through the market crowd with the patient deliberateness of someone who was not trying to lose a tail, but to understand one. He counted 2 behind him and suspected a third ahead, pre-positioned, waiting for him to arrive at a location they had anticipated, which meant they had modeled his movement patterns, which meant the 4 days of pre-contract surveillance had been used, at least in part, to build a behavioral map. He was, to these people, already a known variable. Not fully known, but partially known, which was more unsettling than being unknown because it meant the intelligence gap ran in one direction only. They knew things about him. He knew nothing about them, not a name, not a history, not a single thread. He stopped at a coffee stand and bought an espresso he didn't intend to drink and stood with it, looking at a row of market stalls selling ceramics, and thought with fierce, cold clarity about the asymmetry of his situation. Kira had never been asymmetric before. Kira had always been the one with information the other side lacked. The Death Note was an information weapon as much as it was a killing weapon. You gathered the name, you confirmed the face, you wrote, and the gap between you and your target closed instantly and irrevocably. The entire architecture of his method depended on that informational advantage. These people had removed it, carefully, deliberately, systematically. Whoever had designed this operation had understood his method well enough to build a countermeasure before the first operator set foot in his city. That meant they knew more about Kira than he had believed anyone knew. That was a problem of a different and considerably more serious category. He set the espresso down untouched on the edge of a stall and began walking again, heading nowhere in particular, because he needed the movement to think, and because standing still, he had just realized, was something they would be expecting him to do less of now that he knew he was being watched. keep moving, keep the model unstable, give them variables they hadn't anticipated. Behind him, at a distance of approximately 40 meters, the operator, Ryok, had designated in Light's internal shorthand as the first tail maintained her spacing with the precise, unhurried patience of someone who had done this across 4 continents and who understood, from long experience, that a target who knew he was being followed and kept moving anyway was a target beginning to feel the walls. She did not speak. She had no earpiece. Communication happened at intervals, through methods that left no signal footprint, and right now there was nothing to communicate except that the target was mobile and that the perimeter was holding. She had no name in any record Light could reach. She had been doing this for 11 years. She was very good at it. And the young man ahead of her, walking through a Berlin market with his hands in his pockets and his face perfectly composed, was, she had been told, the most dangerous person currently alive in the city. She found that, professionally speaking, she was inclined to agree. Light turned a corner, and the Hackescher marked fell away behind him, and the street ahead was quieter and narrower and lined with bare November trees whose branches made a dark grid against a white sky. And he walked into it with the deliberate calm of someone who had not yet found his answer, but who was, with absolute certainty, going to find it. He just needed one name. One was enough to change everything. The trap took him 36 hours to design and 4 hours to execute, and it was, by any honest assessment, one of the most elegant things he had ever built. That it failed was not a reflection of its elegance. It was a reflection of who he was dealing with. The core of it was simple, which was always the sign of a good plan. The complexity lived in the preparation, not the mechanism. Berlin's Might district had an extensive network of traffic and pedestrian cameras managed by the city's transport authority, and Light had spent his first 3 weeks in the city quietly mapping their blind spots and coverage overlaps. Not because he had anticipated needing this specific information, but because mapping the surveillance architecture of wherever he was operating was the kind of foundational work he did automatically, the way other people check the weather. He knew which intersections had full coverage, which had gaps, and which had cameras that fed to servers he had already found routes into through a sequence of proxy access points he had built over the preceding month. The plan was to funnel them. If he could not get their names through databases, because they had none, and could not get their names through surveillance records, because they moved in ways that avoided clean capture, then he needed to create a situation in which at least one operator was forced into a context where identification became possible. Not a name on a database, a name spoken aloud, a name on a receipt, a hotel register, a transit booking, something real, attached to a face in a moment he controlled. He had one asset he could use. Her name was Mia, not her real name, a working name. And she was a German national he had recruited 4 weeks prior through a combination of careful manipulation and the genuine ideological appeal that Kira carried among certain people who had lost someone to unpunished violence. Mia had lost a brother. The man responsible had been acquitted on a procedural technicality. She was 27, intelligent, motivated by grief into a loyalty that Light recognized and used without sentiment, because sentiment, in his experience, was what turned clean plans into compromised ones. She did not know his real name. She knew him as a coordinator, She knew enough to be useful and not enough to be dangerous. He gave her a specific task. She was to enter the Hotel Amano on Auguststrasse, a mid-range business hotel with a bar that stayed open until 2 a.m. and a lobby camera system Light had already mapped, and present herself as a journalist working on a piece about private security contractors operating in Berlin. She was to be visible, conversational, specific enough in her questions to generate mild alarm in anyone running an operation in the city, and to note, carefully, without appearing to note, anyone who reacted to her presence with a particular quality of professional attention that Light had described to her in precise detail. She was wearing a lapel camera. The feed came to Light's laptop through an encrypted connection. If any operator in that lobby showed a face long enough and clearly enough for Light to work with, he would be watching. It was not designed to get a name directly. It was designed to generate a reaction that produced a chain, and chains, followed carefully, eventually led somewhere nameable. Ryuk sat on the hotel roof and watched the street below, which was the extent of his contribution to the operational planning, though he had offered several suggestions during the design phase that ranged from unhelpful to actively counterproductive. Light had thanked him and disregarded all of them. The feed came up clean for 40 minutes. Mia moved through the lobby bar with the practiced ease of someone who had done performance before. She had, in university theater, which Light had noted in his assessment of her and filed as an asset. She spoke to a bartender. She spoke to a businessman who was visibly unconnected to anything relevant. She ordered a drink and looked at her phone and generally produced the ambient texture of a young journalist killing time between contacts. At 43 minutes, a man sat down 2 stools away from her and ordered water. Light saw it immediately. The water. Not the order itself. Plenty of people ordered water at bars, but the way the man held the glass. Both hands, loosely, on the bar in front of him in the specific configuration of someone ensuring their hands were visible and unambiguous in a situation they were monitoring. It was a trained posture, a professional's tell, the kind so embedded in muscle memory that it survived even the most careful attempt at casual performance. He was watching Mia, not obviously, not continuously, but in the rhythm of a professional observation. Look, absorb, look away, process, look again. That Light had learned to read the way other people read facial expressions. Light leaned toward his screen. This was the closest he had come to a face he could work with. The man was mid-30s, close-cropped hair, unremarkable features in the specific way of someone who had cultivated unremarkability. The lapel camera gave Light an angle, partial but workable. He studied the face. He opened the death note. He needed a name. He did not have one. He sat with the pen above the page and watched the feed and thought, "That has to be a thread. There is always a thread." And the man at the bar said nothing, showed nothing, and 3 minutes later stood up and left without finishing his water, which meant he had seen enough and was withdrawing, which meant the operation had been made, which meant... Light called Mia's phone. She picked up on the second ring and said his name, not his real name, the coordinator name, and said it at a normal volume in a hotel bar where sound carried, and Light said, "Leave now, leave immediately, take the north exit and get to the street." And Mia said, "What's wrong?" And Light said, "Please now." And Mia said, "Okay," and he heard the sound of a bar stool moving. He watched the feed. She was halfway across the lobby when the man in the dark coat appeared from the eastern corridor. Not the one who had been at the bar, a different one, which told Light the relay had been faster than he had calculated, that they had already repositioned before Mia had even stood up. And the man did not touch her, did not approach her, simply fell into step 20 feet behind her with the loose, unhurried pace of someone continuing a job that had changed shape, slightly but not fundamentally. They were not following Mia because she was a threat. They were following Mia because she led to Light. He understood this at exactly the same moment she walked through the north exit and the camera feed cut to the exterior angle. And he saw the street, and he saw the second operator already outside, already turning to pace her, already part of a box formation that had been assembled around the hotel in the time it had taken him to watch one man drink half a glass of water. He called her again. She didn't answer. The exterior feed showed her moving north on Auguststrasse, walking quickly now, phone to her ear, and the formation moving with her. Patient, precise, unhurried. And Ryuk's voice came from somewhere above the screen, dry and a little curious. Light, they're not following her to find you. I think they already know where you are. Light looked up from the laptop. Across the street from his building, in a window that had been dark all a week, a light was on. He closed the laptop. He sat in the dark of his apartment and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the specific cold weight of a plan that had not merely failed, but had been anticipated, not reacted to, not countered, but anticipated. And the difference between those things was the difference between facing someone smart and facing someone who had read you before you walked into the room. Mia did not come home that night. He did not know yet what had happened to her. He was afraid, in the precise, controlled way he allowed himself fear. That he did. He found out what had happened to Mia at 6:43 the following morning, when her phone, the one he had given her, encrypted, registered to no one, sent a single outgoing message to his number. Not a text, a photo. It showed the phone itself lying on a table beside a single gold coin. The photo was taken by someone else. The message contained no words. It did not need to. Light looked at the image for a long time. He was sitting on the floor of his apartment with his back against the wall beneath the window, which was the position he had adopted sometime around 3 in the morning when the chair had started to feel like a place where a person waited and the floor had felt like a place where a person thought. He'd been doing the latter continuously for hours. He looked at the gold coin in the photograph and understood it the way you understood a word in a language you had never studied but whose meaning arrived anyway, through context and consequence, clean and absolute. It was not a threat. It was a receipt. Mia was currency now. She had been converted from a person into a message, and the message was, "We have reached you did not account for, and we are patient enough to let you sit with that before we use it." He set the phone face down on the floor beside him. He did not allow himself grief. He allowed himself something colder and more useful. A precise, detailed accounting of what the loss of Mia meant operationally. She knew the coordinator name. She knew the encrypted channel. She knew the hotel task and the lapel camera, and the broad shape of his counter-surveillance approach, which meant they now knew it too. She did not know his apartment address. He had always met her elsewhere, a habit of basic operational security that now felt, in retrospect, like the one thing he had done correctly in the last 48 hours. She did not know his face from any angle that a photo existed of. She did not know his real name. These were the limits of the damage. He drew them carefully in his mind, the way a surgeon draws the boundary of what can be saved. Then he stood up because sitting on the floor was finished and began to move. The adjudicator arrived in Berlin on the 9 a.m. flight from Zurich, which Light did not know and would not know until later, when the shape of the day made it obvious that something at a higher level of authority had entered the city. She did not come to the apartment building. She did not need to. She went instead to a series of offices. An immigration processing center in Charlottenburg, a private data management firm in Prenzlauer Berg, a telecommunications routing hub in Tempelhof that had no public-facing identity whatsoever. And at each location, she presented credentials that opened doors without discussion and left behind instructions that were implemented before she reached the next address. By 11 a.m., the identity Kenji Nakamura had ceased to function. The university exchange registration returned an error. The bank account, modest, used only for rent and incidentals, funded through a chain Light had considered impenetrable, was frozen at the source. The mobile contract attached to the Nakamura name was suspended. The apartment lease flagged for review by the building's management company, which was, Light would later discover, a subsidiary of a property group with connections he should have mapped, but hadn't, because no one had ever reached this deep into his cover before, and he had not built his contingencies for an adversary with this quality of institutional access. He discovered the cascade at 11:22, when his transit card declined at a U-Bahn barrier, and he checked the Nakamura account on his phone and found the balance window blank. He stood at the barrier for 2 seconds. Only 2, because standing still at a moment of discovered compromise was the first way people got caught, and then walked back out of the station and onto the street and kept moving, hands in pockets, pace even, while his mind ran the implications at speed. Haruki Sato, the second identity, in the waterproof case behind the baseboard. He had not touched it. They would not know about it unless Mia had known about it, which he had not, or unless they had accessed a level of his operational planning that he had disclosed to no one, which was not possible. Sato was intact. Sato was his floor. He did not go back to the apartment directly. He spent 90 minutes moving through the city in a pattern designed to confirm or deny close mobile surveillance. Varying pace, doubling back twice through covered spaces, using the reflective surfaces of shop windows with the practiced ease of long habit. He picked up one tail and lost it through the Alexa shopping center, moving through the crowd to a service corridor he had noted on a prior visit, and exiting onto a side street that Ryok confirmed was clean. The Shinigami had been quieter than usual since the previous night, which Light had decided to interpret not as indifference, but as the specific quality of attention Ryok displayed when things became genuinely interesting to him. A focused silence, like an audience leaning forward. He retrieved the Sato identity from the apartment in under 3 minutes, entering through the basement, taking the stairs, collecting the case, leaving without unpacking anything else. The apartment was already burned. Everything in it was already lost. He did not look at it as he left. On the street, moving north, He opened the case and checked the contents. Passport, bank card linked to an account seeded 3 months ago and untouched since. A phone, charged, clean. A key to a storage unit in Wedding that contained a bag he had prepared for exactly this scenario. Cash, a change of clothes, a second laptop, 3 weeks of operational continuity in a bag he could carry on one shoulder. The adjudicator's secondary decree reached the Continental's Berlin network at noon. It was simple, precise, and devastating in its strategic logic. Any individual found to be providing material assistance to the target, shelter, resources, intelligence, communication, would themselves be subject to a standing order. Not a contract, a standing order, which in the Continental's grammar was a different and considerably more serious thing, because a contract had a price and an end point and a specific executor, whereas a standing order was open, permanent, and executed by whoever was closest when the condition was met. Light read the practical implication of this within hours, not because he had a source inside the network. He did not. But because 3 separate people he had cultivated as peripheral contacts in Berlin went silent simultaneously, in the specific way that people went silent when they had been told something that made continuing a relationship more expensive than ending it. A researcher at the university who had given him access to a restricted database. A man who ran a print shop in Kreuzberg who had produced 2 of his false documents, a woman who managed a short-let apartment he had used as a dead-drop address. All 3 unreachable by early afternoon. All 3, he understood, had been visited or warned or both. He was, by 3 p.m., standing in a storage unit in Wedding with a bag over his shoulder and no proxies, no cover identity with any institutional depth, no assets and no allies. Just himself. The death note. And Ryuk, who materialized through the storage unit's corrugated metal wall and looked around at the bare concrete interior with his head tilted and said, with genuine conversational interest, "So, what's the plan now?" Light zipped the bag closed. "I'm working on it," he said. The storage unit in Wedding smelled of cold concrete and old motor oil and the faint chemical residue of something that had been stored there before Light and had not been entirely cleaned away. He sat on the bag he had just zipped closed and looked at the corrugated metal wall opposite and did something he almost never permitted himself to do in operational contexts. He stopped planning, just for a moment, and simply assessed, not what to do next. What was true right now, stripped of strategy and contingency, and the forward-leaning momentum that had carried him through 2 years of being Kira, without once letting the present moment settle long enough to feel its actual weight. What was true was this. He was 23 years old, sitting alone in a rented storage unit in a foreign city, with a bag containing 3 weeks of supplies, a supernatural notebook, and no allies. Every cover identity with institutional depth was burned or burning. Every peripheral contact had gone silent. The woman he had recruited and used, and he allowed the word because dishonesty with himself was the one luxury he could not afford, and gotten killed or disappeared or converted into a coin on a table, was gone. The organization hunting him had more reach than any government he had faced, more operational discipline than L had ever deployed against him, and had constructed a countermeasure to his only weapon so precisely targeted that it suggested they understood his method at a level that should not have been possible. And Ryuk was floating near the ceiling, eating nothing, because Shinigami did not eat in the human sense. Looking at Light with those enormous yellow eyes and the permanent, sharp-toothed expression that could mean amusement or an anticipation or simple curiosity, and was, in practice, usually all three at once. "You're thinking very loudly," Ryuk said. "I'm thinking," Light said. "There's a difference. You normally think and plan at the same time. Right now you're just thinking. That's new." Ryuk descended slightly, tilting, examining Light with the interested detachment of a naturalist, noting an unusual behavior in a familiar subject. "You know what I think?" "I don't," Light said, "but you're going to tell me. I think this is the first time since you picked up the notebook that you're in a situation you didn't build any part of. Every other time, the task force, Nier, Mello, you had some hand in the architecture. You knew the room even when you didn't control it. This room," Ryuk gestured broadly at the storage unit, and, by implication, Berlin and everything currently occurring in it. You didn't build. You walked into it, and the people who built it are very good at building rooms." He paused. "I find that interesting. You know, I find things interesting when they could go either way." Light looked at him. "Your confidence in me is noted." "Oh, I'm confident in you," Ryuk said, with the precise inflection of someone who was also confident in the entertainment value of whatever happened next, regardless of outcome. "I'm just saying it's interesting. A god who can't find anyone to strike down is a very specific kind of problem. You know what humans used to call that?" "Don't." "Impotence," Ryuk said, and grinned the grin that had no warmth in it anywhere, only teeth, and Light looked away from him and back at the wall and breathed carefully through the flare of anger that the word produced. Because anger was information about the parts of yourself you hadn't fully examined, and what it was telling him right now was that Ryuk was, with characteristic and infuriating accuracy, correct. The Death Note was the most powerful object he had ever held. It had made him effectively unkillable for 2 years, not because it protected him physically, but because it made him the most dangerous thing in any room his enemies occupied, and the most dangerous thing in a room did not need to worry about the room. Now he was in a room where the notebook was decorative, where it sat against his ribs and did nothing except remind him of what it required that he did not have. He had never felt the weight of it as a limitation before. He felt it now. It was considerable. He stood up. He put the bag on his shoulder. He pushed the storage unit door open and stepped out into a wedding side street in the flat gray light of a Berlin afternoon. And the air was cold and smelled of exhaust and distant food and the wet metal, smell of rain that had fallen earlier and dried on stone. He began walking with no destination because walking clarified and standing still did not, and because movement was also the only surveillance countermeasure available to him now that resources were stripped and he was operating on instinct and intelligence alone. Ryuk drifted above him, invisible to the sparse pedestrian traffic, matching his pace with the ease of something not subject to the friction of the physical world. Light walked for 20 minutes before the architecture of the problem began to resolve into something he could work with. He did not force it. He had learned years ago that certain quality of thinking required motion and patience and the willingness to let the pieces sit in apparent disorder until the underlying structure announced itself. It always announced itself eventually. The question was always whether it did so before the situation became unrecoverable. The core constraint was identity. He could not write a name he did not have. He could not get a name through databases that had been scrubbed. He could not get a name through assets who had been neutralized. He could not get a name through surveillance infrastructure he no longer had access to. Every route he had tried or considered had been foreclosed, either by the organization's own preparation or by the adjudicator's systematic dismantling of his support network. But the constraint contained, as constraints sometimes did if you looked at them from the correct angle, its own inversion. They were protecting their operatives' identities because they understood that an identity was what made a person writable, which meant they believed correctly that an identity was the condition, which meant their entire operational posture. The ghost protocol, the relay surveillance, the database suppression, all of it, was built around denying him that condition. It was a wall, a very well-constructed wall, but walls, by definition, faced one direction. He was not going to get a name by looking at the operatives. He had established that conclusively. But the operatives were not the only people in this structure. There was the organization itself. There were the people above the operatives. There were the handlers, the managers, the institutional figures whose function required a degree of visibility that pure field operators could dispense with. The adjudicator had come to Berlin personally. She had visited offices. She had presented credentials. She had, by the logic of her own role, done things that left traces. Not in the databases Light could access from a laptop in a flat, but in the physical world, in the memories of people who had opened doors for her and processed her paperwork and perhaps, if they were the kind of people who noticed things and retained them, registered a name. He could not hack a scrubbed database, but he could talk to a bureaucrat. The idea was fragile and required a sequence of steps, each of which had a meaningful probability of failure, and the whole chain collapsed if any single step did. But it was a chain, and chains were workable, and workable was all he needed right now to keep moving forward instead of sitting in a storage unit waiting for the walls to finish closing. He took out the clean phone from the Sato kit and dialed a number from memory. It rang 4 times. A man answered in German, cautious, the specific caution of someone who did not recognize the number. "It's Nakamura," Light said, using the dead name deliberately as a credential the man would recognize. "I need one thing. Then I disappear, and you never heard from me. I need the name of whoever came through the Immigration Processing Center in Charlottenburg this morning on a private credential clearance. Single visitor, female, between 8 and 10 a.m. He paused. "I know you have access to that log. I know because I helped you keep your position 6 weeks ago when you needed someone to help you. This is what that help costs." One name. Silence on the line. Long enough that Light counted it. Then the man said, very quietly, "I'll call you back." "You have 1 hour," Light said, and ended the call. He kept walking. Above him, Ryuk had gone quiet again, which meant he was paying attention, which meant he thought something was about to happen. Light thought so too. He didn't yet know if it was going to be the right something, but after 36 hours of being entirely reactive, of watching traps fail and identities burn and assets disappear, he was moving forward again, and forward, however uncertain its destination, was the only direction that had ever produced anything worth having. The phone sat in his jacket pocket. He walked and waited, and thought about names. The callback came in 51 minutes. Light was sitting on a bench in a small park off Müllerstrasse, the kind of park that existed in Berlin's residential districts as a municipal afterthought. 4 trees, a path, 2 benches, pigeons with the specific indifference of city birds who had long since stopped registering humans as a category worth acknowledging. He had chosen the bench because it had sight lines in 3 directions and because the open space meant approach could not be concealed within 20 meters, which gave him time he could use. He answered before the second ring. The man on the other end spoke quickly and quietly, in the manner of someone reading from something they intended to destroy immediately afterward. He gave a name, a single name, German, female. He spelled it once. He did not wait for acknowledgement, and he did not say goodbye, and the line went dead before Light had finished processing the sound of it. Light sat with the name for a moment. He turned it over. He tested its weight. It was not the adjudicator's name. The adjudicator was too senior, too careful, too practiced in the architecture of institutional invisibility for her name to appear on an immigration log that a mid-level civil servant could read back from memory. What the name represented was a step below that. An attache, perhaps, a handler. Someone who had entered through the same channel, on the same credential clearance, whose name had been marginally less suppressed than the person she was traveling in the orbit of. A thread. Not the thread. But the thing about threads was that you did not need the right one immediately. You needed one that led somewhere, and somewhere, followed with enough patience and intelligence, eventually became the right place. He had something the death note could theoretically reach. The problem remaining was the face. A name without a face was half the condition, and the notebook's mechanism was not negotiable on this point. He had tested those limits years ago, and they were absolute. He needed to see her, not a photograph. A photograph might work. He had used photographs before, but the photograph needed to be of the actual person, not a file image, not a composite, not a reconstruction. Real, recent, unambiguous. He spent the next 4 hours building the chain that would get him that photograph, and it was the most concentrated piece of operational thinking he had done since arriving in Berlin, and it required him to work with nothing. No assets. No infrastructure, no institutional access, and to substitute for all of those things the one resource that had not been stripped from him, which was the quality and speed of his own mind operating at the edge of what it could hold simultaneously. The name the civil servant had given him was attached, through the immigration log, to a hotel registration, not directly, not in any database he could reach, but inferentially, because the credential clearance that admitted private operatives through the Charlottenburg Processing Center automatically logged an accommodation address for the duration of the visit. He could not access that log, but he knew which hotels in Berlin accepted that category of private credential registration because it was a short list, and he had mapped Berlin's institutional accommodation infrastructure in his first week as a matter of routine, the same way he had mapped the camera networks and the transit blind spots. 3 hotels. One of them was the most probable given the clearance tier and the operational posture he had observed, the kind of establishment that was expensive enough to provide genuine privacy infrastructure and discreet enough not to require it to be advertised. He went to that hotel. Not inside. The lobby was a controlled environment, and entering it was a risk he could not price accurately enough to accept. He went to the street facing the main entrance, to a coffee shop with a window seat that gave him a direct sight line to the hotel's entrance canopy, and he ordered something and sat down and waited with the stillness that long surveillance required and that he had trained in himself over 2 years until it felt less like patience and more like a natural state. Ryuk sat on the hotel canopy and watched the door from above, which was useful, and narrated intermittently, which was less useful but unavoidable. Light filtered the narration and watched the entrance and drank his coffee slowly and thought about names and faces. In the 41 minutes he had sat with his pen above a blank page 2 days ago, watching a woman stand on a corner and remain alive, and what it had felt like, and how it would feel different this time if the chain held. She came out at 4:17 in the afternoon. Ryuk said from the canopy, "The woman from the log, grey coat, she's coming out now." Light did not move toward the window. He tilted his head fractionally and let his peripheral vision pick up the figure emerging under the canopy, and held it there, not looking directly, building the image with a sideways attention that was less likely to trigger the instinctive awareness that trained people had of being directly observed. 35, dark hair, grey coat exactly as Ryuk had said, moving with the brisk, purposeful efficiency of someone between tasks rather than departing. She paused under the canopy to check her phone. 4 seconds. 5. Light looked directly at her for those 5 seconds. He did not look away until she moved. Then he looked down at his coffee cup and held her face in his memory with the focused precision of someone who understood that what he had just seen was not going to be available to him again and who could not afford the image to degrade. He reconstructed it methodically. The structure of the face, the specific set of the jaw, the way the light from the canopy had caught the left side. He held it. He fixed it. He reached into his jacket and took out the death note. He set it on the table in front of him. He opened it to the next clean page. He uncapped his pen. He wrote the name the civil servant had given him, spelling it precisely, exactly as it had been spelled to him. Then he held the face in his mind, not approximating, not constructing, but remembering with the kind of total recall that had always been one of the things that separated him from ordinary people. And he completed the entry with the additional specification the death note's rules permitted. Cardiac arrest. 60 seconds from the moment of writing, because 60 seconds gave her enough time to be clear of the hotel entrance and the immediate cluster of pedestrians, which was operational cleanliness, which mattered. He capped the pen. He looked at his coffee cup. He counted. At 58 seconds, Ryuk said from somewhere above the street, "Oh, there she goes." Light did not look out the window. He did not need to. He heard the sudden shift in ambient street noise, the quick exclamation in German, the sound of a phone hitting pavement, the particular quality of alarm that pedestrians produced when something unexpected happened to someone near them. He heard it and noted it and felt, moving through him in a wave that he never entirely suppressed and never entirely indulged, the specific satisfaction of a mechanism functioning exactly as designed after days of functioning as nothing at all. He closed the death note. He put it back inside his jacket. He left enough cash on the table to cover the coffee and a reasonable tip because unremarkability extended to the financial texture of your interactions, and walked out of the coffee shop and turned north and kept moving at an even pace while behind him the street reorganized itself around the event that had just occurred in it. One name, one face, one entry. It was not the adjudicator. It was not any of the 6 field operatives. It was a single attache whose death would register in the network as a loss, but not yet as a capability. They would not know, from this alone, that he had found a way through the identity suppression. Because they did not know the chain he had built to get here, and would not know unless they traced it back through the civil servant, which would take time, and time was what he had just purchased. He had the death note working again. It was a narrow aperture. It was one thread in a structure that had many, but it was open, and it pointed inward, and if he followed it carefully and quickly enough, it pointed toward names he actually needed. Ryuk materialized beside him, matching his stride, grinning. "Better," Ryuk said. "Don't," Light said. "I'm just saying, better." Light said nothing. He walked north through the gray Berlin afternoon with his hands in his pockets and the notebook against his ribs and the cold, forward-moving clarity of someone who had found the first foothold on a wall they had been staring at from the bottom for 3 days. It was not victory. It was not safety. The 6 operatives were still in the city. The adjudicator was still in the city. The contract was still open at 40 million coin, and the high table had resources he had not yet seen the ceiling of. But he had written a name tonight that he was not supposed to be able to reach. And in the morning, the network would wake up to find one of its people gone, with no explanation, with no mechanism they could trace, and they would understand, slowly, then all at once, that the thing they thought they had contained had just reached through the wall they built around it. Let them understand that. Let them feel what it meant to have built a perfect countermeasure and find it had a seam. He was Kira. And Kira did not run out of ideas. He ran out of patience occasionally and time, sometimes, but never ideas. And the people who had staked 40 million coin on the assumption that anonymity was an absolute condition had just discovered, at the cost of one of their own, that in Light Yagami's hands, no condition was ever truly absolute. He turned a corner. The city swallowed him. The news reached the adjudicator at 6:40 in the evening. While she was sitting in the hotel room she had not slept in yet, reviewing a physical file she had brought from Zurich and would destroy before leaving Berlin. The call came from one of the 2 operators who had been pre-positioned in the city before the contract issued. The one Light had internally catalogued as the most senior presence in the squad based purely on the quality of his stillness. The way he occupied space with a minimal footprint of someone who had learned that visibility was a tax and had spent years reducing his bill. He told her what had happened in 4 sentences. She asked 2 questions. She ended the call and sat for a moment looking at the file in her lap without reading it. The attaché had been careful, not field careful. She was an administrative operative. Her suppression was procedural rather than the deep-built instinct of someone who had spent years moving through hostile environments. But careful enough that the chain Light had built to reach her was, in the adjudicator's assessment, extraordinary. He had started from nothing. He had no assets, no infrastructure, no institutional access. He had found a civil servant with an outstanding obligation, extracted a partial identification from an immigration log, triangulated a hotel from an infrastructure map he had apparently constructed before any of this began, and then sat in a coffee shop window and memorized a face in 5 seconds. She closed the file. She had been in this work for 22 years, and she had administered contracts against heads of state, against 3 sitting intelligence directors, against an elder-appointed operative who had decided that the High Table's authority was negotiable and had needed to be corrected on that point with considerable finality. She had never encountered a target who operated the way this one did. Not with weapons, not with money, not with leverage, but with pure cognitive architecture, building structures out of nothing, finding seams in walls that had been designed to have no seams, and doing all of it while being actively hunted by 6 of the most capable field operators the Continental network could field. She picked up the phone again and issued a single instruction, which she had been holding in reserve because it represented an escalation she preferred to deploy deliberately rather than reactively. The instruction was this: the contract parameters were amended. Containment was no longer the primary objective. The target had demonstrated an ability to identify and reach personnel through chains that should not have been constructible, which meant proximity to any Continental-affiliated individual was now a liability. The new objective was termination. Fast, clean, total. No further attempts to understand his method, no further attempts to isolate and study. End it. The 6 operators received this amendment within minutes, and the texture of the operation in Berlin changed immediately, the way weather changes when a front moves through, not gradually, not negotiably, but all at once, the air becoming something different than it had been. Light felt the change before he understood it. He was moving through Prenzlauer Berg in the early evening, navigating by a mental map he had constructed and revised continuously over 11 weeks, when Ryok said from above him, with slightly more urgency than he typically deployed, "They're moving differently, all of them. The ones I can see, they're converging." Light turned immediately into a side street, not running, because running was information, but accelerating to the upper edge of a walk that could still pass as purposeful rather than panicked. Direction. From 3 sides, the 4th side is the park. I can't see anyone there yet, but that doesn't mean there isn't someone. The park was Mauer Park. Light knew it. Open ground, good sight lines, terrible for concealment, which made it either the gap in the encirclement or the obvious trap depending on how well they had modeled his tactical thinking. And the answer to that question was, based on everything that had happened in the past 4 days, probably the latter. He did not go for the park. He went for the street to his left, which ran between 2 rows of pre-war apartment buildings close enough together that the gap between them was narrow and poorly lit, and offered angles that a converging formation would have to slow down to navigate cleanly. He was 30 meters into that street when the first one appeared at the far end. Not running. Walking with the controlled acceleration of someone closing distance efficiently, hands visible, coat open, not for warmth. Light processed this in fractions of a second and turned to look behind him, and the second was already at the entrance to the street. The same configuration, same pace, and the walls of the apartment buildings rose on either side of him, and the street smelled of damp brick and old iron and the cold that comes off stone after dark. He was boxed. He had been boxed before, in different configurations, by people who ultimately could be named and therefore neutralized before the box closed. These 2 he could not name. He did not know their faces in any context attached to a record. They were, to the death note, still air. The one behind him reached him first. What followed was not a fight in any sense Light had prepared for. because Light had not prepared for fights in the physical sense, had never needed to, had always resolved conflict at the level of information before it descended to the level of bodies. The operator was faster than Light, stronger than Light, and had the specific applied economy of someone for whom violence was a practiced craft rather than an emergency measure. Light took a strike to the right side of his ribcage that moved him sideways into the wall, and then the wall was against his back, and the operator's forearm was across his collarbone. And the pressure was not crushing, but it was absolute. And Light understood in the precise, unambiguous way that physical reality communicated its facts, that he was being held by someone who could hurt him significantly more than this, and was choosing for the moment not to. Which meant they still wanted him alive. Which meant the termination order was directed at his operation, not his person. They wanted to end Kira. They may have wanted to understand first how much of Kira existed beyond this body. Networks, disciples, infrastructure. Before they removed the body from the equation, his right hand was pinned at his side. His left was partially free. The notebook was inside his jacket on the right, unreachable. He stopped resisting the hold. Not from surrender, from calculation, because resistance against a trained operator in a hold, this clean-produced injury and no tactical gain, and he needed his mind working at full capacity right now, which meant he could not spend it on the blunt arithmetic of struggling. The second operator had reached them and stood 3 feet away, watching, hands loose at his sides, and his face was close enough that Light studied it with the focused desperation of someone searching wreckage for a specific object. 40, perhaps. A scar along the left jaw, old and well-healed. Eyes that were not cold exactly, but had the quality of instruments rather than expressions. Calibrated, purposeful, measuring. A face. A face he was memorizing with every second the man stood still enough to allow it. He did not have a name. But he had the face now, stored with the total recall he had spent years trusting. And if he could get a name, any name, by any chain, however fragile, the face was ready. The operator holding him said something in a language Light didn't immediately place. Not German, not English, somewhere in the Eastern European register. And the one with the scarred jaw responded briefly, and neither of them looked at Light while they spoke, which told him the exchange was procedural, and that he was, in this moment, cargo rather than a conversational party, which was clarifying, if not comforting. Then the one with the scarred jaw reached into his coat, and Light, whose mind had been running the available options at speed since the moment the forearm crossed his collarbone, did the only thing available to him that was not waiting. He dropped his weight suddenly and completely. The dead drop that removed a person from a standing hold faster than a hold could compensate for, and the forearm came off his collarbone, and he had exactly 2 seconds before the operator behind him adjusted, and he used both of them to run. Not toward the park, not toward either end of the boxed street. Through the ground floor door of the apartment building immediately to his right, which was unlocked because Berlin's older residential buildings frequently were, which he had noted on a prior walk through this specific street, which was not luck but preparation, wearing luck's clothing. He took the stairs up 2 floors, crossed to a rear-facing window, looked out at the building's back courtyard, and climbed through. He was bleeding from the right side where the wall had caught him. Not seriously, enough to register. Above the courtyard, invisible, Ryuk watched him land and straighten and begin moving again with the expression that meant the Shinigami had found the evening's entertainment sufficiently compelling to suspend his usual editorial commentary. Light pressed his left hand briefly against his ribs. He breathed. He had a face. He did not have a name. The gap between those two things was the entire problem and the entire opportunity, and the distance across it was, he was beginning to understand, the length of whatever time he had left in this city before the next wave arrived, and the one after that, and the one after that, because 40 million coin bought a great deal of patience from people who were very good at being patient. He started moving again. He needed a name. He had one more idea about where to get one. He had one more idea, and it was the most dangerous thing he had attempted since arriving in Berlin, which was a meaningful distinction given the preceding 4 days. It required him to stop running. It required him to place himself deliberately and with full knowledge of the risk in a location the network could plausibly anticipate. And to do it not from desperation, but from the specific strategic logic of a person who understood that the only way to get a name from an organization that had scrubbed its people from every database was to make one of those people say it themselves. The civil servant from Charlottenburg had given him a thread. The thread had gotten him a face on a hotel canopy and an entry in the death note and one dead attaché. But the face he had memorized in that boxed street, the operator with the scarred jaw, the one who had reached into his coat before Light dropped his weight and ran. That face was stored and ready and waiting, and the name attached to it was somewhere in the physical world, spoken between people who knew each other, used in rooms Light had not yet been inside. He needed to get inside one of those rooms. Not literally, figuratively, which in practice meant the same thing it always meant. Find the right person, in the right position, with the right outstanding reason to give Light what he needed, and apply pressure at the correct point in the correct sequence. He had done this his entire operational life. He had done it against L's task force, against the Japanese police, against Near and Mello and every institutional structure that had ever tried to close around him. He was very good at it. The difference now was that he was doing it with a cracked rib, in a foreign city at night, with 6 operators tightening a net around him and an adjudicator in a hotel room issuing amended instructions to people who were no longer trying to contain him, but to end him. The person he needed was Decker. He had been thinking about Decker since the beginning, since the moment he had reconstructed the evening at Brenner and Saurin, and understood that the man at the bar with the filing eyes was the thread that had unraveled everything. Decker was the one who had seen him close the notebook. Decker was the one who had made the call. Decker was, by the logic of Continental protocol, no longer directly involved in the field operation. He had submitted his report. His function as the inciting observer was complete, and he had likely been stood down from the Berlin operation to avoid the conflict of interest that came with personal investment in a contract's outcome, which meant he was in the city or close to it, but not inside the active perimeter, which meant he was, relative to the 6 operators currently hunting Light through Prenzlauer Berg, marginally more accessible, and Decker had a name. Decker had operated under Continental sanction for 11 years, which meant his suppression was deep, but his existence within the network's internal records was real. He was not a ghost in the way the field squad was Ghost. He was a professional with a history, and histories in Light's experience always had surfaces if you found the right angle to press. He found the angle in 40 minutes of walking and thinking through the cold Berlin night, with Ryuk overhead providing aerial surveillance and occasional commentary that Light was too focused to process beyond the directional content. The angle was this. Decker had been present at Brenner and Sohn as additional security requested by one of Saurin's associates. That associate was not high table. That associate was a peripheral business contact whose name was in no suppressed database because he was not a Continental operative. He was a civilian adjacent, the kind of person who knew how to hire the right people without being one of them. Light had the name from his original research on Saurin's network, conducted weeks before Victor Saurin had ever sat down to his last meal. He had the name because he had been thorough, as he always was, and thoroughness was the only thing that had never failed him. He found a public terminal in a late-night library branch and used the Sato Identity's credentials to access a business registry. He found the associate's company address. He found a phone number attached to a registered director. He memorized both. He called from a payphone because payphones still existed in Berlin in the particular way. That useful thing survived in cities that were old enough to have decided what they actually needed, and he spoke to the associate in the careful, specific German of someone who knew exactly what they were asking and exactly what pressure they were applying. He did not threaten. Threats were blunt instruments. He presented a fact that the associate had arranged private security through Continental channels for a man who was now dead, and that the nature of that arrangement, if it became known to the wrong people in the wrong way, would create problems that the associate would find considerably more expensive than a single piece of information shared in a brief phone call. He said this calmly and without elaboration, because elaboration was for people who were not sure their point had landed. The associate was quiet for a long time. Then he said a name. It was not Decker's operational name. It was the name underneath the operational name. The real one. The birth one. The one that existed in the record of the world before Continental suppression had been layered on top of it like paint over stone. Paint over stone could be stripped. Light had just stripped it. He thanked the associate. He ended the call. He stood at the payphone with the receiver still in his hand for 2 seconds, holding the name in his mind next to the face he had been carrying since the evening at Brenner and Sohn. The man at the bar, the filing eyes, the gray coat, the practiced stillness of someone who watched rooms for a living. He took out the death note. He did not write immediately. This was the moment, and he treated it with the precision it deserved. Decker was not a criminal by any definition Light had previously applied. He was a professional. He had done his job. He had reported what he saw, which was his function, and that report had set in motion everything that followed. Mia's disappearance, the burned identities, the cracked rib, the 4 days of being dismantled piece by piece by an organization that had been built over centuries specifically to dismantle people. Light held all of that in his mind at once and assessed it without sentiment, because sentiment was what happened when you let the personal texture of events obscure the operational logic beneath them. The operational logic was this: Decker alive was Decker available to be used against him. Decker was the network's only living witness to what the Death Note actually did. the only person who had watched him close a notebook and watched a man die and connected those two events with his own eyes. If the adjudicator had Decker's account, the operational briefing the 6 squad members had received was built on it. Every adaptation the network had made, the Ghost Protocol, the identity suppression, the Ghost Squad itself, had been architected around what Decker saw and reported. He was not incidental to this situation. He was its foundation. Light wrote the name. He specified cardiac arrest. He specified 7 minutes, which was long enough that the event would not occur in proximity to the payphone, because the payphone was the last place he had been stationary, and stationary positions were how patterns got reconstructed. He capped the pen. He put the notebook back. He walked away from the phone and into the night and counted in his head with the patience of someone who had done this many times and knew that the counting was not what he was actually doing. What he was actually doing was waiting for the world to confirm, one more time, that it operated according to rules he understood and could use. At the 7-minute mark, Ryuk said nothing. He didn't need to. Light kept walking, south now, toward the river, where the air was colder and smelled of moving water and distant industry, and the city opened up on either side of him into the specific Berlin combination of old stone and lit glass, and the wide, dark presence of the Spree cutting through it all like a fact that predated everything built on its banks. He stopped on a bridge and looked at the water and breathed and took inventory of what the night had produced. 2 names written, 2 entries. The attache in the afternoon, Decker now. The squad still intact. 6 operators, unnamed, untouchable by the notebook, still in the city, still contracted, still hunting. The adjudicator still in her hotel room with her amended instructions and her 22 years of institutional authority and the full weight of the high table behind her. The contract still open. 40 million coins still in circulation, attached to his face, his description, the behavioral model they had built on 4 days of watching him move through the city. He had won 2 small battles tonight. He was under no illusion about what that meant in the context of the larger war. He was still in Berlin. He was still compromised. He had a cracked rib and one viable identity, and a death note that required a chain of human intelligence to function against an organization specifically designed to eliminate the conditions that chain depended on. He was, by most honest measures, losing. He was losing intelligently and creatively, and with considerably more resilience than the high table had anticipated when they issued the contract. But he was losing nonetheless, and the distance between intelligent losing and actual losing was a distance that closed faster than people expected when the opponent had unlimited resources and genuine patience. He needed to leave Berlin. He knew it. He had known it for 24 hours and had stayed because leaving meant moving through a city that had him surrounded. And moving through a surrounded city required a plan, and the plan had not been ready. It was closer to ready now. Not because of anything he had built tonight, but because of what tonight had taught him. About how the network moved when its parameters changed. About the specific configuration of the perimeter when it shifted from containment to termination. About the gap in the eastern approach that Ryuk had identified during the Prenzlauer Berg box and that Light had filed and not yet used. He would use it tomorrow before dawn, when the network's night rotation was thinnest and the gap was widest and the city was quiet enough that movement could be precise. He pushed off the bridge railing and turned to go. and stopped. On the far side of the bridge, standing at the southern end with his hands in his coat pockets and the river wind moving his collar, was a man Light had never seen before. Not one of the six. He had memorized every description Ryok had given him, and this matched none of them. Not the adjudicator. Not anyone from the network's Berlin operation as he understood it. He was tall, still, and he was looking at Light across the length of the bridge with the patient, untroubled directness of someone who had been here for some time and had expected Light to arrive at this bridge at approximately this hour, which was not possible by any chain of logic Light could immediately construct, because he had not known himself that he was coming here until 20 minutes ago. The man did not move toward him. He simply reached into his coat pocket and held something up, and the bridge lights caught it, and it glinted gold. A coin. Not the same coin that had appeared in the photograph beside Mia's phone. A different one. Newer. Placed deliberately where Light could see it, which meant it was not a payment, it was a communication. A grammar point in the language of this world Light had stumbled into, and what it was saying, translated out of coin and into words, was, "The first contract is already obsolete." The man put the coin back in his pocket. He looked at Light for one more second. Then he turned and walked south, and the darkness took him in 4 steps, cleanly, completely, as though he had been designed to disappear into it. Light stood on the bridge with the river moving below him and the city breathing around him, and understood in the specific way that genuinely dangerous information arrived. Not with drama, but with the quiet, absolute weight of a door closing. That whatever he had survived in the last 4 days was not the thing he needed to survive. It was the introduction to it. The high table had not sent its best. They had sent a first wave to understand him, and now they understood him. And somewhere in a room with no windows, a second coin had just been placed on a table, and the hand that covered it belonged to someone whose name Light did not have, whose face Light had never seen, and who had, based on the 4 days of intelligence the first wave had gathered on Kira at the cost of 2 lives and considerable operational disruption, already begun to plan accordingly. Ryuk drifted down beside him and looked south, where the man had been, where there was now only bridge and dark and moving water. "Light," Ryuk said, and for once the amusement was entirely absent from his voice, replaced by something that on a Shinigami's face passed for genuine interest, and in this specific moment felt considerably closer to warning. That one had different eyes. Light said nothing. The river moved beneath the bridge. The city held its breath, and in a room far from Berlin, in a chair that faced a window overlooking a city that was not Berlin, a figure sat with a single gold coin turning slowly between 2 fingers, and did not speak and did not move, and had been thinking about Light Yagami for considerably longer than Light Yagami had been thinking about them. The notebook was not going to be enough. Not for this. You just watched Light Yagami survive the first wave. 2 names in the notebook, 1 cracked rib, 6 operators still breathing, and a man on a bridge with a gold coin who just told him, without a single word, that everything he has faced so far was a warm-up. The high table has not sent its best, not even close. Whatever you think is coming in part 2, you are not ready for it. The link is in the description. Click it now, or spend the next week wondering